Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In today's video I am looking at Lenin's Russia, in particular the idea of political authority, and we're going to be touching on parts of ideology and essentially looking at the kind of political system that Lenin created during and in a period after the Russian Civil War. So from the A-level specifications, this is AQA 1H. It tells us that we need to know political authority and government, new leaders and ideology, Lenin's Russia, ideology and change. There is more of the bullet point that goes on to Stalin, but I'm going to deal with Stalin in later videos. And then we've got political authority and government, the consolidation of Bolshevik authority. And this is what I'm going to be looking at today. And this runs alongside the videos I've done already looking at in detail the Russian Civil War. So in terms of political authority, one of the key institutions that is created is the Sovnarkom. Now, the Sovnarkom is a council of people's commissars. So it's formed in 1917 following the October Revolution, and essentially it's an executive branch. It's like a cabinet that we would have in modern Britain, and the chairman of the council is the equivalent of a prime minister. So the Sovnarkom met every day, and essentially its job is the day-to-day running of Soviet Russia. In 1918, Lenin created a new constitution. It was published in July, and this claimed to place all powers in the hands of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. So if you remember Lenin going back to his April thesis, he'd spoken about all power to the Soviets, and this looks like he is creating that, and the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was responsible for electing the Sovnarkom, but this is largely just propaganda. I mean, Lenin is very much a centralist when it comes to political authority. He wants to keep hold of that power right at the centre of the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, and the centre of the state. He doesn't want to be giving it out to other people. He essentially doesn't really trust others to carry out this revolution that he has set forth in his mind. So essentially, the Sovnarkom is really chosen by the Communist Party Central Committee, i.e. the Bolshevik leadership. The Congress of Soviets met kind of infrequently, whereas the Sovnarkom ran the country on a day-to-day basis. So this still looks a lot like an old-fashioned authoritarian state with the like a king and his ministers running the country, and some kind of rubber stamp parliament that kind of meets occasionally and doesn't really have very much power. So if you think back to the Tsars, the Tsar Nicholas II and his Duma, then to me there are some quite strong parallels here. So theoretically the new centre of power is the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, but in reality the real power is the Sovnarkom, and the Sovnarkom is run by the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. So there's not really much people power involved is what's going on in these early days of Soviet Russia. Now, the Russian Civil War has a very strong impact on the Bolshevik government, and it starts to make some very fundamental changes. So Moscow becomes the capital in March 1918. Now, Lenin essentially moved the capital away from St. Petersburg to Moscow so that the government was further away from advancing white armies. So this is suddenly an enormous change for Russia, but it's fundamentally a reaction to what's going on in the Civil War. We also see the brutal murder of the Tsar and his family. They were murdered by their communist guards, and essentially they were shot in the basement of a house where they'd been held captive. Now, again, there's quite a lot of smoke and mirrors, I think, in a lot of this. Lenin denied ever actually ordering the murder and blamed over-enthusiastic local officials. However, in a state like Lenin's Russia, it's hard to believe that anybody would have been brave enough to carry out such radical action without the authority from those at the centre. Now, the communists were worried that the Tsar become a figurehead of the White Armies in the Civil War. So again, the decision to kill not only the Tsar but all of his children can be seen as a simply circumstantial. It's linked to the fact there was a civil war going on. But I think it's fundamentally, I think this is something that probably would have happened anyway, because Lenin wouldn't suffer any other form of authority or potential challenge to his grip on power. Now, moving forward into looking at some of the political systems that create. So we've got the Sovnarkom, which is created in 1918, essentially. So is running the show, in 1918. But in 1919, in March 1919, we had the creation of the Politburo. Now, this again, some of this is circumstantial to the Civil War. Lenin wants to concentrate decision making into the hands of an even smaller group of communist leaders. Therefore, he's formed the Politburo. Now, the Politburo is part of the party system, not part of the government or state system. So it's a structure. The two structures run parallel to each other, and it can be slightly confusing at times. And often party kind of trumps state in a way, and in a lot of other ways they are essentially the same thing, because this is a one-party state. So the Politburo took over formulating policy from the Sovnarkom. Now, the Sovnarkom are made up of about 15-20 people. The Politburo is somewhere normally between 7 and 9. So yes, it's streamlining things. It's a smaller group of members that are making the decision. Well, why not just shrink the Sovnarkom? Well, again, I think the answer to that is because what we're looking at here is party control, and it is in the party that Lenin's control is absolute. So the Sovnarkom then starts to meet less frequently as we go into the 1920s, and all the key decisions have been made by the Politburo. So we've then got another step away from the Soviets, the All-Russian Soviets. So we're kind of again seeing the centralization of power in the hands of these few people at the top of the party. We're going to go to the creation of the Org Bureau, and now this was created to supervise, I should probably put inverted commas around that, local party committees, so essentially tell them what to do and make sure that they're kept under control. And it's to make sure that they were carrying out the decisions made by the Politburo. So what we've got here is a mechanism of bureaucratic control. Stalin was a member of both the Politburo and the Org Bureau, and that, again, Trotsky famously described him as the grey blur. And it's this kind of bureaucratic work in which Stalin really kind of thrived, and it gave him a huge amount of influence, because he was using his position in these bodies to control what was going on at local party level, and therefore make sure that that was full of his supporters. So a centralized mechanism, which essentially Stalin is later on going to use to his own benefit. As I mentioned already, Russia becomes a one-party state. So the Bolshevik Party becomes the Communist Party in March 1918. Now, this is essentially just a renaming. The Bolsheviks were always communists. The significance of this is there were other communists, Mensheviks, SR, other Marxist groups who could claim to be communist groups. So you couldn't call yourself Communist Party as easily before, because there were multiple other communist parties in Russia. So the significance of this is there is now only one Communist Party, because there are no other parties. And it became a one-party state, and so therefore through the Sovnarkom, and that represented the only path to communism. And in Lenin's mind, there was only one path for Russia to communism, and that was through his guidance and his leadership. And Lenin dismissed the idea of sharing power even with the other communist groups. But his pledge to all power to the Soviets becomes kind of empty words, as a Petrograd Soviet and all the other and the All Russian Congress of Soviets are all sidelined in favour of the Sovnarkom, and then the Sovnarkom is sidelined in favour of the Politburo, and so we see essentially this elite group of Lenin and those around him who are controlling everything in Russia, which doesn't look enormously different to what Russia had had before, when they'd had a Tsar and the nobility, the elite around him, controlling everything in the country. But Lenin's a Marxist, so this doesn't seem to quite be right. Well, Marxist principle is that power should come from the people, and that essentially was being ignored in Lenin's Russia. Now Kamenev and Zinoviev both resigned temporarily, albeit as Lenin created this one-party state. They favoured more cooperation with other groups and again listening to the people. But Lenin followed his idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in this period, he was determined to crush bourgeois attitudes. And bourgeois attitudes were essentially anything that was counter-revolutionary. And he felt that the Russian people were not ready for communism, that essentially they were doing two stages of revolution in one. They were going through the bourgeois period and through into the socialist stage all in one go. And so there was an extra degree of guidance needed, and him and his party were the people to do it. And anything that got in his way was going to be crushed. And this is demonstrated by the dissolving of the Constituent Assembly. Those who then protested against that, and they were shot at. 12 of them died. And this really highlights that this is not only a one-party state. This is a dictatorship. Now, Lenin's morality is always a really interesting thing to look at. I mean, if you can call it morality, it's not morality in a normal sense. It doesn't kind of believe in absolutes of right and wrong. He kind of essentially believes in by any means necessary. So in his mind, anything that furthers the revolution and the move towards communism is justified. Anything that gets in the way is immoral and must be destroyed. So people getting are not necessarily doing bad things. They're just doing something that he sees as, and the party sees as being a block getting in the way of the movement towards this communist state that they wanted to create. So Lenin essentially has his own form of Marxism called Leninist Marxism, and there's lots of ideas in this. I'll talk about a few of them. So the Russian Revolution did not follow the path that Marx said revolution would take place. It wasn't a spontaneous uprising of the proletariat. It was led by the Bolshevik party. So it's a party-led coup, not a class-based revolution. It was limited to Russia. It was not part of a worldwide revolution. So Lenin takes the writings of Marx and Engels and he adapts them to match the events going around them. And a lot of people writing about Lenin talk about him essentially being a pragmatist and how he bends things to match what's going on around him. And therefore there seems to be a degree of fluidity in his ideology. But that goes back to what I said previously about his morality. Essentially, anything goes as long as it's moving towards his communist utopian society at the end of it. If lots of people die in the meantime, if lots of people are treated really badly in the meantime, then that is just the price worth paying. If you trample on some elements, key elements of Marxist theory to get there, then that doesn't matter, because what matters is that you get there in the end. So Lenin claimed that the party represented the people. Now, there was no need for bourgeois ideas such as democracy, the way you actually asked the people what they wanted, because clearly the Communist Party were communists, and therefore they knew what was in the best interest of the people. And this was something that all the people would come to realise, essentially, or else. And that or else is really important. So the Communist Party would tell people, this is what is best for you, and you will agree with it. We know what's best for you. You might not know what is best for you. He also claimed he was in a coalition with the left-wing SR, so there was this criticism that he wasn't sharing power. He said, well, look, I am. But that ended with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, and the terror actually starts with Lenin. Normally, all the stuff on the terror is focused on Stalin, and when we look at Stalin, I will look at all the stuff with the terror, but actually the first show trials is the kind of these big trials which are highly publicized and essentially propaganda and exercises where the decisions are already made. There's no element of justice in it, but it is just illustrating to people what happens if you go against the party. Saw 34 members of the SR condemned, 11 of them were executed, and the SR party was banned. Now, as I've said, Lenin just saw things in terms of what helped and preserved the revolution and things that stood in his way. Everything that moves things out of the way of the revolution is justified. And this, he says, fits with Marx's writing in terms of the overall message, because the proletariat taking complete power is, according to Marx's theory, inevitable, and Lenin is just speeding it up. But he's not altering history, he's just adjusting what's going on. And again, there are lots of Marxists who really dislike what Lenin was doing with it. Even if you look at contemporaries such as Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, there's a lot of socialist communists writing at the time who disagree with this route that Lenin took. Arguing with this route in Russia, however, is essentially now illegal. Now, to preserve this state that Lenin was created, there needed to be a lot of repression. So the Civil War did much to shape ideology on this, highlighting the fight against counter-revolutionaries, which is the way that the white armies are essentially named by the Bolsheviks. So anybody who was against the Bolsheviks was counter-revolutionary, even if they just believed in a communist revolution, but a different type of communist revolution or different form of socialism to the one that the Bolsheviks were putting forward. So they used terror to eradicate all opposition. The Cheka, the secret police, played a really key role in this. Other parties were targeted. So, for example, over 5,000 Mensheviks were arrested. The Bolsheviks centralized control of the economy, leading to this idea of war communism, which essentially was that all the food and everything else belonged to the government, and the government was going to control all means of production. Now, this ultimately it was replaced by the new economic policy, which looks a lot like capitalism in 1921. And this, again, is a sign of things being pursued in an ideological, less of an ideological way, more of a pragmatic way by Lenin. And again, this is something that I'll look at in more detail in another video. So Lenin created the principle that the party was always right and did not make mistakes. Now, this is a terrible precedent to set, particularly when you're going to be followed into power by the likes of Stalin. So again, this shows this idea that Lenin just refused any kind of argument, and that therefore there was one truth in Russia. And if you were against that one truth, then you were counter-revolutionary, and there were terrible, terrible consequences for that. So censorship became more extensive. Dozens of Russian writers were deported to show it was not a good idea to criticise the government. All books, poems, other writings had to be submitted for approval before they could be published. And again, so we get this solid message. And this is part of the idea of eradicating bourgeois ideas, that essentially their freedom over these would be removed. The church is also attacked as a potential rival. And anything else that could take authority away from the Bolsheviks is removed. The Cheka was renamed the GPU, and the main means main political administration in 22, and the secret police grew in importance. An arbitrary arrest was a common experience for many Russians as people were denounced, and information was spread. So if there was even the slightest hint that you were not following the Communist Party line, you were in trouble. To take this even further, in 1921 we get the ban on factions. The increasing use of terror and economic problems caused by the Civil War led to differences in opinion within the Communist Party. Some felt the party was pursuing policies that were too harsh, that the workers were not actually. The whole reason for the revolution was the benefit for the workers, and actually what was happening was not to the benefit of the workers. The workers were having a really, really bad time. And so you've got this group forming within the party known as the Workers' Opposition. And this whole thing worried Lenin. Party unity, as he saw it, was absolutely vital for the new communist regime to survive. They were internally divided. They had no chance of withstanding the pressure that was coming from outside the party, not only within Russia, but from outside Russia as well. And therefore in 21, he at the 10th Party Congress, he banned factions. So, and what that essentially meant is once the Central Committee of the Communist Party had made a decision, then nobody could openly disagree with that policy. And this is going to prove hugely significant in the rise of Stalin. He's going to accuse people of factionalism. We'll see it playing a really important role in the Great Terror again, because people are accused of having formed factions. So if there's any dissent against that central voice at this point in time, Lenin's, then again, horrendous consequences. And not only have we got a one-party state, but essentially we've got a one-party state which, beyond a certain point, no internal debate is allowed. And this is a really worrying position. More worryingly, again, we've got the impact the Russian Civil War had on national minorities. So the Bolsheviks had shown significant support for the idea of national self-determination when they were opposing the Tsar and when they were opposing the provisional government, but all that disappeared once they were in power, because all independence movements were seen as counter-revolutionary, even if those nationalist movements were socialist or communist. 22, Stalin was the People's Commissar for Nationalities, and he brutally suppressed an independence movement in his native Georgia. So Stalin was Georgian, but he crushed the nationalist movement there. This horrified Lenin when he found out Stalin had lied to him about the fact. Stalin had said, look, the popular support is on our side against this nationalist movement. Well, actually, the fact was the opposite way round, and the Bolsheviks only managed to overthrow the independent socialist regime in Georgia through very heavy fighting, bringing about huge loss of life. But Stalin survives, and obviously is later on going to rise up into complete power. In 1922, the new version of the Constitution established the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and again we see the Soviet in there again, but we've already seen in Lenin's line of political authority the Soviets don't actually carry that much power. This was strongly controlled from the centre, and with each republic being a branch of the Sovnarkom, but again we've seen how the power has really moved from the Sovnarkom to the Politburo, and so the Central Committee or Politburo is passing stuff down to the Sovnarkom, which is then going out to all the different branches across the Soviet Union. In 1923, we get this thing, a nomenclature, and this is a new system where there is a list of 5,500 party and government posts is drawn up. So these are all the key administrative and political positions that you can hold. Now, those positions could only be appointed with the approval of the Central Committee. Therefore, what really counted was your loyalty to the people on that committee, rather than necessarily your expertise in actually doing a good job. If you wanted to get promoted, therefore, you didn't make any challenge or debate the decisions of the leadership. You went along with them. And if you then could get one of these positions, and you then get a reward of special privileges and things like better housing. Doesn't sound very communist, does it? But that is what happened. And this is a really important step to the centralisation of control within the Communist Party. And this system, alongside the ban of factions, made it very difficult to raise any objections to the decisions of the Politburo. And one of the key figure really in kind of making these appointments and controlling all the kind of the boring bureaucracy around all of this was Stalin. And therefore that kind of loyalty that you needed to get those kind of jobs was loyalty to Stalin, and that is going to be one of the reasons later on why he is going to take power following the death of Lenin. So again, we are seeing centralized, strong control held by the Bolshevik elite, the Communist Party elite at the center, and any kind of dissension not only not being tolerated, but we're getting things like ban on faction and use of terror to remove any who stand in the way of those people right at the center. I hope that's given you a good understanding of the political authority and some of the political ideology under Lenin in these early years of the Soviet Union. So this is part of my Tsarist and Communist Russia playlist, which is designed for A-level history, in particular the AQA Unit 1H, and I am going through all the way from the 1850s all the way through into the 1960s. So going through the Tsars and the provisional government, and then Lenin and Stalin and on to Khrushchev. So it should give you everything you need for that unit once the playlist is complete. So please do subscribe and turn on notifications to find out as more and more videos are added. Thank you very much for watching.